Students, welcome back to another flipped lecture, and today we're going to be discussing the post-war United States and the early Cold War, both at home in the United States and abroad around the world. So we talked about the Cold War and the start of it as a watershed moment, and the Cold War is going to change the United States, and it's going to influence almost everything from pop culture to military interventions abroad. So this policy of containment, which you've heard about both in a lecture and after you've read George Kennan's long telegram, this idea is going to come to dominate every aspect of American life. So what does containment look like? And the reality is that containment isn't just one thing. There's economic containment, there's domestic containment within the United States, there's political containment, both in the United States and around the world, and also military containment, where the United States would actually use its force in order to contain communism. When talking about economic containment and the idea that the United States could use its economy in order to fight communism, the best example is what became known as the Marshall Plan. In the first flip lecture, you saw how Europe was devastated and destroyed by World War II. This happened before the First World War, and the devastation ended up creating the conditions in these countries for the rise of dictators like Adolf Hitler. The United States wanted to avoid this fate a second time, and so they came up with a plan to rebuild Europe after World War II. The United States spent $13 billion, which was 5% of the total value of all goods and services in the United States in 1947. So this was a pretty big investment for the United States to be making in Europe. But this plan paid off, and all the investment to rebuild the European countries created a very rapid recovery and an economic boom for both Western Europe and the United States. Western Europe basically got back on its feet and became a big trading partner with the United States. And this had a couple of impacts on the Cold War. The first is that a strong economy in Europe meant that communist revolution was going to be less likely. And it also meant that these countries would be more loyal to the United States because they had helped them out in their time of need. However, not all the European countries accepted the Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union and all the nations that the Soviet Union controlled refused to accept the United States' help to rebuild after World War II, thus showing that the Cold War had already begun as early as 1947. Here's a picture that is in Germany of the Marshall Plan, and you see these men are rebuilding a bombed-out building. You can see that there is a little poster in the back basically saying that this project is a part of the Marshall Plan. Here's a great political cartoon that ran in newspapers shortly after the Marshall Plan was refused by the Soviet Union. As you can see, the basketball player looks a lot like Joe Stalin, and the ball that he is intercepting is the Marshall Plan. So basically it's this idea that Joe Stalin is trying to prevent the United States from having any influence in the part of the world the Soviet Union controlled. So now let's talk about how containment worked inside the United States. Because it wasn't enough just to fight communism in other countries, the United States basically had to fight communism by doing things within their own country. And there are two big aspects of this. The first is the domestic policy of readiness, which we're going to talk about in a minute. The next is that basically the United States took a policy of trying to define their image in the free world and basically tried to promote the idea that the American way of life was the best way that people should live. A big part of containment inside the United States was the idea of readiness. And the Civil Defense Corps was developed in order to provide a group of citizens who was well trained and could serve in an emergency or in the event of an attack. These workers were basically trained in how to survive and help other people survive an attack. This is still around today, although it has changed its name and now primarily deals with natural disasters and much less with the prospect of war with another country. There were also a series of videos that were put out, including one video known as Duck and Cover, in which school children were taught what to do in the event of an atomic bomb. And why would they show kids this movie and why would they make it? The reason is to show the Soviet Union that the United States was prepared in the event of an attack, so that the Soviet Union might think twice about attacking the United States if they were ready for it. During this time, people also built a lot of bomb shelters and created evacuation plans. If you go into an older building, chances are it has a bomb shelter left over from this Cold War period. And to kind of sum all of this up, really Readiness is about a show of force and readiness for war inside of the United States. This was designed to serve as a deterrent for the Soviet Union attacking the United States. Here's a picture of a poster of the duck and cover mascot whose name was Bert the Turtle. If you want to do a quick YouTube search for duck and cover or Bert the Turtle, you can find the full video and watch it on your own. It's a very funny video. I would suggest giving it a look. This is a picture of Nevada in 1951. As you can see, there's a massive mushroom cloud in the distance and United States soldiers in front. This is because during this time, the United States tested and ran military exercises to basically practice using an atomic bomb and then attacking with a regular army. So, there actually, in the West, are a lot of places where nuclear bombs were detonated, and some of them are still radioactive to this day. A lot of these soldiers would also suffer health problems later in life because of exposure to the radiation. During this time, it's not sure whether or not people fully understood the power of the atomic bomb, but these tests had a real impact on the United States, and they were all meant to intimidate the Soviet Union, basically showing that the United States was ready for nuclear war. So now let's talk about how the United States military would be used during the Cold War. And the whole idea of this is the idea of a proxy war. A proxy war is a war in which the two countries that are fighting each other are not actually fighting each other directly. They will use third parties, other countries, other groups, to fight instead of actually fighting each other directly. We're going to have plenty of examples of what a proxy war is, so if you're not quite sure of this definition yet, you will be very, very soon. And part of the proxy war is the development of the Truman Doctrine. President Harry Truman basically had to come up with a foreign policy, and he had to make decisions about how to deal with the Soviet Union. So he published a document that said that the United States would support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. To sum that up, it means that the United States will intervene with their military in any country that might be taken over by communists. This idea basically 100% reflects George Kennan's suggestion as to what to do about containment. Here's a picture of Harry Truman, and very, very famously, he has his little thing, "The buck stops here." The idea that President Harry Truman took responsibility and was involved in the planning of all of the events that would unfold. So now let's talk about early containment and early proxy wars. And the first two proxy wars of the Cold War were in Greece and in Turkey. After World War II, civil war broke out in Greece. And the United States realized that there was a side that was communist. And so the United States sent $400 million in aid to the Greek government in order to defeat the communist rebels. So the United States basically used the Greek government to fight a war against communism in the country of Greece. Then the United States would be tested again in the country of Turkey. And after World War II, the Soviet Union wanted control of a passage in the Dardanelles. This passage would basically allow them better access to the sea and to the oceans, and so the Soviet Union was pressuring Turkey to try to take over this passage. But the United States committed another $100 million to Turkey so that their military could maintain control of the passage and defeat the Soviet Union. So the United States, very, very quickly after World War II, had already been involved militarily in two conflicts by sending money in order to fund the militaries of Greece and Turkey. Just to give you guys an idea of the map, this is basically the way the world was divided during the Cold War. Everything in blue are part of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And everything in red are members of the Warsaw Pact, which is essentially the communist version of NATO. But if you can look on the map, you see that Greece and Turkey are both bordered by communist countries and are very, very close to the Soviet Union. So the United States basically pledged to help those countries remain not communist in order to maintain their influence over that part of the world. So now let's talk about the Korean War, this first major war that the United States military would be involved in during the Cold War as part of containment. As you can see on the sign, the 38th parallel is going to be a very important idea in this war. Korea is often known as the Forgotten War because most people don't really know much about it. Most people know a lot about World War II, maybe the American Civil War, World War I, but very few people know about the Korean War. But it was a 3-year war that lasted from 1950 to 1953. And the root of this problem was that after World War II, Korea was partitioned. That means that Korea was basically cut in half at the 38th parallel on the world map. So the Soviet Union was occupying the northern part of Korea, and the United States was occupying the southern part of Korea after the war. And what was supposed to happen was that the Koreans were supposed to have free elections, and they were supposed to vote in a new government and take their independence from the United States and the Soviet Union. However, these elections failed, and the northern part of the country became communist and was basically taken over. After North Korea was taken over by communists, they decided to invade South Korea in order to try to unite the country under communist rule. The United States basically decided that they were not going to allow South Korea to fall to communism. So the United States and the new United Nations supported South Korea, and they actually sent soldiers in order to repel the invasion. But on the other side, the Soviet Union was supplying the North Korean army with basically tanks and guns and other support in order to fight the United States and United Nations troops. So the Korean War is a perfect example of a proxy war. And the result of this war in the early days were that the United States and United Nations ended up defeating the North Koreans and pushed them pretty far north to a place called the Yalu River, which was the border between North Korea and the communist country of China. However, the People's Republic of China, which was a communist government, did not like the fact that those United States and United Nations troops were so close to their border. And so the Chinese came into this war. And once the Chinese entered the war, it tipped the balance of power in favor of North Korea and the communists. And so the United Nations, the United States forces, were forced to retreat all the way back to the original dividing line at the 38th parallel. After this, both sides decided that they wanted the war to end. So they signed an armistice, which did not actually end the war, but basically was just an agreement that there wouldn't be any more fighting. But Korea would stay divided and remains divided to this day. And there's a 2.5-mile demilitarized zone in which neither side can have any sort of weapons or soldiers or tanks. Unfortunately, though, this 2.5 miles that separates North and South Korea is full of things like landmines and traps. And these landmines and traps are actually still an issue to this very day because so many of them were put in the ground during this period of the Korean War and shortly after. Here are some images of the Korean War. These are United States troops basically going into battle. And here's a village of Panmunjom, which is basically a small village in the middle of the demilitarized zone. As you can see, it's fenced off with all sorts of warnings, and actually a lot of people from that village die every year due to landmines and other such traps. So let's talk about how Korea was a proxy war. A proxy war, again, to reiterate the definition, is a war that happens when opposing powers use third parties as substitutes for fighting each other directly. So the Soviet Union supplied China and North Korea on one side, and the United States supplied South Korea on the other. And the United States actually sent soldiers to participate in this war. And in this war, approximately 36,500 Americans are going to die to basically keep South Korea from falling to communism. Here's a picture of Korea, so you can basically see that demilitarized zone and kind of see where all of this stuff is happening. This is a picture of the demilitarized zone today. This is the North Korea side. So basically this is still around today. The idea that these two countries are still very hostile and this demilitarized zone is still a very, very hot issue. Again, here are South Korean troops patrolling the border of the demilitarized zone. And all of this really meant that the role of the United States had changed in the world. Before the year 1945, the United States had mostly been an isolationist nation. That meant that the United States did not get involved in any of the affairs of the rest of the world. Except for World War I, the United States largely stayed out of affairs in Europe and other places around the world, except in basically North America and South America. But after 1945, the United States is going to be involved politically, economically, or militarily in almost all world affairs, and this is a trend that has continued up until today. The Cold War also had a huge impact on American society and American culture. As you can see in this, even Captain America comics got on board, where Captain America, now instead of fighting the Nazis, is going to end up fighting against the communists. Just take a good look at this cover, and that'll kind of give you an idea of where we are going with this part of the lecture. And the thing about the Cold War is we talk about culture wars, but the Cold War is the original culture war in modern history. It's an ideological war, meaning that it's a war of ideas, a war of beliefs. And it's going to take on almost religious tones in both countries. The idea that our way of life is best and our way of life is the only way of life. And basically this conflict is going to be the idea of Americanism versus the idea of Soviet communism. So where is this battle of ideas going to play out? It's going to play out in proxy countries, other countries around the world. You saw with Korea how that can happen. But also, this is a war that's going to be fought in the cultural sphere. Within each nation and within each nation's citizens, this war would be fought. So, battlegrounds are going to include the Olympics. Who wins, the United States or Soviet Union? Movies. You're going to see that there are a lot of movies during this time that are going to be very pro-American and very anti-Soviet. Comic books even, with Captain America getting on board, everything in American culture becomes a battleground for this war between Americanism and Soviet communism. And all of this led to the development of something that historians have come to call the American religion. The idea that there is a belief system about being American during this time. It is a civil religion, meaning that it doesn't really have any sort of belief about God, but it's about beliefs about the United States. And it's an ideology, a belief system, that is really nationalistic and focuses on the idea of the American way of life. It's going to include a heavy emphasis on nationalism, the ideals of freedom and democracy. It's going to have a lot to do with consumption and buying of goods, because that celebrates the idea of capitalism versus the idea of communism. And it's also going to involve a belief in God, because communists are atheists because communism as a belief system says that there is no God. So let's talk a little bit about nationalism. I first want to bring up the idea of how American history was written and told during this time. There's a concept called the grand narrative, in which basically you focus on history as telling this great story, where you kind of blot out all the bad and only focus on the good. This isn't a real way to look at history, but this is a way to look at history if you want people to believe that the United States is the greatest country that has ever existed on the face of the earth. Another thing that was kind of interesting about nationalism is John Wayne movies and the emergence of westerns as a popular form of entertainment. And basically all these westerns serve as a metaphor for the idea of World War II and John Wayne as a metaphor for America. That all these movies were good guys versus bad guys, and the United States were always the good guys. This led to the idea that we are all John Wayne because Americans are great. But there were also some consequences of the Cold War at home that are actually going to end up causing a lot of progress in the United States. Before Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president during World War II, died in 1945, he gave a speech about the new American way of life, in which the fight for civil rights for all Americans actually becomes a part of the Cold War. In this speech, Roosevelt said, "A new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed." A lot of historians will argue that the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 60s were made possible by the Cold War, because the Cold War put pressure on the United States to be the example of freedom in the world. And it's hard to be that example of freedom if you are denying freedoms to groups of people. And a good example of how this played out was, as early as 1948, Harry Truman integrates the armed forces, meaning that he would no longer segregate people in the army based upon race, religion, or any other such distinctions. I also need to bring up the idea of consumption. And consumption basically just means buying things, consuming resources. As you can see in this graph, the gross national product of the United States, which is basically the goods and services in the country, the value of those is going to skyrocket throughout the 1950s. And so let's take a look at how that happens. Consumption in the consumer society in the United States emerges after World War II. The United States factories are going to retool. This basically means that these factories that had been making bombs, planes, tanks, and guns for the war are going to start making consumer goods such as home appliances, cars, tractors, and other such things. And because these factories are so large and so efficient, this means that goods can be produced on a mass scale. All of this is going to lead to the creation of the Consumers' Republic, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I also want to highlight two other pieces. The first is that because Europe was largely destroyed by the war, the United States was in a unique position to control a large part of the world's economy. The rest of the world's factories have been destroyed, the United States hasn't. So the United States was able to basically increase their trade and increase their wealth during this period. And another thing that helped the United States develop economically was the GI Bill. Basically, this was a bill, a law that was passed, that provided benefits for veterans of the Army during World War II and beyond. This GI Bill included benefits that allowed more people to go to college than had ever been able to go before. And with college meant that new higher skilled jobs could be created in the United States. There was also the Veterans Administration, which helped get housing loans along with the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, which meant that people who had never been able to buy homes before would now be able to buy homes. And all this home buying would lead to the development of the suburbs. So let's look at a quote from a book called The Consumers' Republic by the historian Elizabeth Cohen. And she points out something about mass consumption. That mass consumption did not only deliver wonderful things for purchase, it also dictated the most central dimensions of post-war society, including the political economy, so the way that public policy, what the government does, and mass consumption economy mutually reinforced each other, as well as the political culture, how political practice and American values, attitudes, and behaviors tied to mass consumption became intertwined. That's a very complicated quote, so let's break it down. Basically, this whole idea is that the American consumer is now a purchaser as citizens. So, the consumer satisfying personal material want is actually serving the national interest. This is the idea that American citizens began to believe it was their duty as Americans to participate in mass consumption, buy as much as they could, and participate in the market as much as possible. This is a Cold War mentality. The idea that if the communists don't believe in capitalism and don't believe in private ownership, that American citizens must be super capitalist and basically try to buy and purchase and participate in capitalism as much as possible. So, historians are still trying to measure the impact of this consumer culture on the modern day that we have now. Here are some advertisements from this era. I think you guys will get a kick out of these, so I'm just going to show them to you. Try to pay attention to the kinds of products that are being advertised. So think about how these advertisements reflect the idea that we were talking about with the tyranny of the brands. So this is kind of the development of that idea of mass consumption in the modern United States. The idea of mass consumption has been around for a long time in this country, but it really picks up during this era and is going to have a big impact on the modern one. So now let's talk about how God becomes American. You hear a lot of people say, God bless America, and all the things like that. Under God is in the Pledge of Allegiance. Let's talk about how God becomes American. The doctrine of communism, the belief system that communism is, says that there is no God, and that religion is basically just something to keep people happy. And so communism means atheism. So, religious freedom is still important in the United States, but Americans basically are going to contrast themselves with the Soviet Union by saying Americans believe in God. It doesn't matter what God you believe in, but because the United States is not communist, the United States must believe in God. And this is reflected in a few things. Under God, that phrase was only added to the Pledge of Allegiance in 1954. And in God We Trust was adopted as an official USA motto and put on money as late as 1956. So these ideas are actually relatively new and were a product of this Cold War mentality. So let's tie this all together. And basically Melvin Leffler, who's a historian, came up with the idea that America waged war abroad, so Korea, Greece, Turkey, and eventually these other conflicts we're going to talk about, to protect the ideas of freedom at home, the political economy of freedom at home. So the idea is that everything in American life, from comic books to the military, is going to be viewed through the lens of international relations and foreign intervention in other countries. The idea that the Cold War is going to come to dominate everything in American life. So, hopefully now you're able to reflect a little bit more on this thesis, but see if you can go back to the other parts of this Cold War mentality and see if you can connect them all to this central idea. In future lectures, we're going to discuss the impact of these belief systems on actual events that are going to happen in American history.